Good morning and welcome to this webinar. My name is Susanne Weismüller and I work for ALFI's legal department. Some of you may know me as coordinator of ALFI's PRIIPs working groups, which is the reason why I speak today. But luckily, I'm not on my own. I hand over to Ulf Herbig, who will introduce himself.
Thank you, Susanne, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Ulf Herbig. Some of you may also know me from a couple of the ALFI working groups, and I used to be a delegate for ALFI at the Findatex, for the PRIIPs, the MiFID, the SFDRs. But now I'm here in my new role as CEO of Kreios, a Luxembourg-based development firm and RegTech that was founded in 2006. But Susanne, today we're going to talk about the partnership that we announced in May this year, right?
Yes, indeed. We come to this in a minute. Let me share some practical organizational information first. So we will have 45 minutes for the presentation and to address questions from members. We have 3 polls with questions to the audience, so please stay close to the computer so that you can participate in those polls. And it's important to know that the webinar is recorded. It will be shared later through our member collaboration hub, and also the slides will be shared by email with the audience. So now, what will this webinar be about? The title is From Regulatory Guidance to Operational Compliance, Using Responsible AI and Rule-Based Controls to Strengthen Fund Compliance. Actually, and if you mentioned it, it's a joint initiative between ALFI and Kreios, which was launched in May this year. Kreios has developed a platform, it's called Regmatics, which aims to check in a consistent and quick manner whether PRIIPs kits comply with existing rules. And here ALFI comes into play because, as you know, we have, I would say, a famous Q&A document on PRIIPs since a couple of years, and you actually use this content to feed it into the Regmatics tool to make those checks complete, I would say. It's also worth noting that the topics or the project may be extended to other fields at a later stage. So overall, the partnership aims at making regulatory industry guidance more accessible, supporting in particular the ALFI members because they benefit from a reduced license fee, but also the wider market in navigating complex requirements. We will explain why the offer is not in competition to services provided by other ALFI members. I hand over to you, Ulf, for the content and Virginie. Thank you. You can switch to the second slide.
Thank you, Susanne. Yeah, we're covering these aspects that you mentioned, Susanne, in 3 main areas, and then some members had kindly addressed some questions up front already, which we prepared, and we will go through at the end. If there is some time left, we're happy to, of course, answer other questions. In case we're running out of time, then please continue to ask questions and we will answer them after this webinar. So we will start with the Luxembourg market and the regulatory context to really see where we're actually coming from and why we're here together. Then followed by the challenges and the risks that are addressed by the Regmatics platform and the initiative together with ALFI. And then, of course, to explain you a little bit what we are doing and how we are doing this in particular, because we are conscious of the fact that whenever firms hear AI, then some alarm bells may ring. And therefore, it's probably most important that we also give you a bit of insights on the technology and the process of how we are translating the ALFI Q&A PRIIPs guidance into executable rules where we limit or even eliminate the typical risks that AI brings with it. Before we go into the first section, we have prepared 2 questions as a poll, and it would be great if you can share your views before we go into the first paragraph.
Okay, and we hope it works because my colleagues from events told me it's the first time that we use Slido in combination with WebEx. So Monica, I hope you can show the first poll question. It's a multiple choice question. I read it out loud. I see it's just opening. So here we are. Where do you currently see the biggest operational pressure in regulatory disclosure management? A, volume of documents and share classes. B, multiple languages and jurisdictions. C, frequent regulatory updates. D, coordination across internal teams and providers, or E, evidence of oversight and control. Please vote, and I see already votes are incoming. We will wait a bit for the result.
It's very exciting to see the moves. It's a bit what we were expecting, wasn't it? The volume and the frequency of regulatory updates head to head, but frequency of regulatory updates. Maybe while everyone is answering, an insight on the frequency of regulatory updates. If you think about 10 years back up to now, the introduction of new regulations like SFDR, MiFID, and the likes has led to the point that from comparing 10 years ago back to now, we've probably added around 1,000 new data points to the funds universe, and more than 600 alone came from SFDR. And by all the versions that we have also seen from the Finatechs with the EPT, EMT, EETs, etc., I think it's no surprise, Susanne, isn't it, that the frequency of regulatory updates seems to be the winner here, followed by the volume of documents, and of course, coordination of across teams and providers is third. Also no surprise, no?
No, it's not surprising. Okay,
Right.
let's go to the second question before we go to the first topic. So rating. Question, how confident are you that regulatory requirements and guidance are applied consistently across all relevant documents in your organization? So from 1, non-confident, 2, slightly confident, 3, moderately confident, 4, confident, and 5, very confident. Okay, I think, Ulf, it's somehow as expected.
Yeah, it's somehow as expected. We should have had the follow-up question in the sense of how confident are you that you can actually prove that you have consistently applied regulatory guidance, which is a different thing compared to I am generally confident, right? Because appliance is one thing, and thinking that things are in the right way is a different thing. But again, 42, 41% is also a bit as expected. And it's fortunate because it would be a bit worrying if the bars would have been more on the left-hand side.
Indeed. So we can go to the next slide.
Great.
Ulf, you will explain the
Thank
Luxembourg
you.
market.
Exactly. Thank you everyone for the answers. So where are we coming from and what's the situation really today? I mean, Luxembourg is the second largest fund hub when it comes to assets under management, but what really characterizes perfectly the Luxembourg fund market is that we have a large domestic market with a big cross-border footprint, which means that most funds domiciled in Luxembourg are not generally sold in Luxembourg in their majority, but moreover, they are exported or so-called passported into other jurisdictions. And that in particular adds additional requirements, not only because firms have to adapt different languages, but also potentially, as we know, that regulation is sometimes quite ambiguous and there may be interpretations that may differ even from one country to another. Or requirements that differ from one country to another. Thinking about PRIIPs in Switzerland, you have a different version. Thinking about the UK, then you have another different version if you were to produce PRIIPs kits, or if not, then at least you produce a UCITS kit and you are up to the CCI transition now. So all of this adds complexity already from a regulatory standpoint, as well as from a production perspective. That also brings me to the point of the fragmented value chain. I mean, Luxembourg has a great ecosystem with a lot of strong firms that have specialized in certain areas. But as we have seen in the first question of the poll, ranked number 3 was the coordination amongst internal teams and providers. So whilst on the one hand, it's great to have all the expert firms serving individual parts of the value chain, at the same time, that requires coordination, but also oversight in that sense, as that the data that is often borne either by the fund firms themselves or the administrators or the providers that help the fund firms, that has to be checked, that has to be controlled, and it needs to be ensured that this is consistent. And consistency brings me to the last point from that slide. We see increasing expectations from the regulators. If you look at the publication in December from the CSSF regarding the annual PRIIPs update, then the CSSF was in their last sentence saying that the CSSF reserves the right to sporadically check the consistency between the prospectus and the PRIIPs kit. And that is just one small evidence regarding regulatory expectations, because of course, if you think about MiFID II, then information need to be fair, clear, and non-misleading, which means that it's not just about the PRIIPs kit and the prospectus, it's basically every other material disclosures and reportings made available to NCAs, but even more so to investors that have to show the same information. As a last proof point, you may have also seen last year the AMF in France was even publishing their results from an internal project where they have been starting to check the compliance of SFDR disclosures with regards to the regulatory requirements, and the CSSF, coincidentally, in their 2026 priority list, in the top 3 priorities, they added ESG SFDR disclosure consistency as another requirement and focus point of the CSSF. So
Yes.
when we, Susanna?
Maybe just to add on this point concerning the checks by regulators, and you mentioned sporadic checks, and note also from the PRIIPs kit that they perform sample checks. So I think there they will also use AI going forward to do more consistent and more frequent checks of PRIIPs kits, for example. That's why all this initiative is somehow to anticipate this development and to help members to ensure compliance, because it's better to be prepared in time.
Very true, Susanna, because I would say the regulators typically do not consider themselves as the innovators. So whenever the regulators have successfully proven that such technology works on the oversight side, from their perspective, they would of course expect fund firms to have already adopted such technology and or processes on their side, to not just be confident. That was the second question that we had, right? Not just to be confident that regulatory guidance and expectations is applied consistently, but also that you can evidence and prove it. And that brings us now to the next slide, where we will look at the actual operational process. So the operational reality is really that often we have a mixture of official regulatory guidance, then people start looking at these regulations and discuss, like in the ALFI expert groups, in order to build Q&As. And the reason why we have these Q&As is because often regulation is not black and white. Regulation is subject to interpretation, and it may even mean that the members debate and do not come to an agreement, and that what you find in the Q&A is a best practice that may not necessarily reflect the opinion of 100% of the members, but the majority. Now, therefore, we have regulations, we have Q&As from the regulators who acknowledge the fact that sometimes the law or the technical standards are not clear enough, and then they publish Q&As. But that's why the associations are so important, not only in Luxembourg, but also abroad, because when you distribute your funds in other jurisdictions, you want to make sure that your fund does not only follow the best practice in Luxembourg, but also the best practices in all your countries of distribution. Now, of course, from all these regulatory guidances, they have to be applied across hundreds of documents and languages, but also providers, because if you think that you produce different outputs with different fund firms, of course, some information may be overlapping, and you need to make sure that that information has been used by all internal systems and or external providers in a consistent way. But not only the data component is important, also the regulatory component is important. So it must be ensured that any regulatory requirement is applied on any of your products where it's applicable in a consistent way. We saw that regulatory change is the top challenge and concern of the member firms, where of course it is necessary that whenever there is a regulatory change, you do not only update rules or data points, but in the case of an outsourced environment, you also need to ensure that these changes are reflected properly. Because of the fact that without modern technology, most fund firms sit in a process and a value chain where they do sample checks simply because of capacity constraints. It's impossible to make sure that every language, every document holds the same data and applies regulatory requirements consistent. And that's exactly why we have thought it's great to have that partnership with ALFI to help firms moving away from manual sample checks, where there is often a 4 eyes principle with limited documentation, to 100% control with full documentation. But before we go into these challenges even more so, I think, Susanne, you have prepared, as we received some member questions around PRIIPs as well, you have prepared a brief update also what firms can expect and what's the latest on the PRIIPs regulatory side.
Yes,
On the
thank
next
you,
slide.
Ulf. As you said, regulation is always changing, and it's now the retail investment strategy which will lead to changes of the PRIIPs regulation. As regards timing, they've just concluded the trilogue negotiations, and the final text is expected to be published in the official journal by the end of this year. And from then, we will have 18 months until the new rules will enter into force. So according to the questions raised by members, I have prepared a quick overview of 5 points. For sure, there are others that are important to note, but here I mentioned these 5 points. The PRIIPs kit will have a new dashboard, so a new section that is entitled Product at a Glance, which will provide a summary of the various features of the PRIIP. And then second point, and that's a long-standing request from the industry to include past performance again in the kit, as it was the case for the UCITS kit. Third point, the requirement to review and revise the kit will cease to apply where the PRIIP is no longer made available nor open to new subscription and cannot be purchased on the secondary market. So that's also a welcome change. Then in terms of format, the electronic format of the kit may be provided by means of an interactive tool, which could allow to display personal preferences. Actually, we were a bit critical about this proposal because the so-called layered approach may lead to the fact that the investor overlooks certain features of that is relevant to him or her. And the last point is a new comparison tool for multi-option products. So the PRIIP manufacturers will be required to provide investors with tools that facilitate research and comparison among different investment options, including on costs. And here the ESAs are asked to pay due attention to the implementation of costs for companies. That's, as I said, a quick summary, but at least some impression of what will come up in a couple of months.
So if we put that timeline in a broader context, then I'm afraid that firms will just have completed their CCI transition projects next year in the UK and can already focus on the next update with regards to the implementation of these, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. So
okay.
before we move to the next section, the section number 2, which is challenges and risks, we have prepared another 2 questions in the poll, and it would be great also if you could share your insights here.
The first one is again a multiple choice question. How are regulatory document controls mainly performed in your organization today? A, mostly manual review. B, manual review supported by checklists. C, sample-based controls. D, partly automatic controls. Or E, largely automated with audit evidence. So please let us know. See, votes are done.
And by the way, the responses are anonymous because the first thing that comes to my mind is obviously to understand the size of the firms responding to each individual category, because sometimes you may assume that larger firms may have more capacity to build out automated controls compared to smaller firms. But either way, regardless of the size of the firms, we can clearly see that over half of the firms perform manual review, and manual review supported by checklists. And that's a bit another proof point, Susanna, why really with our initiative here, we want to help firms moving away from these manual reviews and even checklists, because ultimately a checklist is a human actioned item that is not necessarily an evidence, right? You can consider it an evidence, but if the human does an error in terms of just checking things up, then you have a checklist, but it has no real meaning. So we can clearly see that with just 25% partially automated and largely automated, there is still a lot of room for improvement when it comes to the regulatory controls.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So second question is a ranking. Which risk is most difficult to manage in regulatory document production? Please rank your top priorities. First, missed updates. Second, inconsistent disclosures. Third, late remediation. Fourth, weak audit evidence. Fifth, unclear ownership between teams and providers.
Yeah, the missed updates, I would have also thought ends up first, because what we often see is really that you have different owners of different information in organizations, right? And if these owners now start communicating this updated information, and it may be as simple as a name change of a fund, then it's not 100% ensured that that update flows through to all different teams that have to work with that new fund name and or the providers that have to reflect that new fund name. The same is true when you have ad hoc or event related updates, like for the risk and the performance and the cost information, right? You may have annual updates, but if there is material changes throughout the years, then of course everyone has to be aware of that information. So I think
Absolutely.
we can close that one as well. Thanks a lot for the insights. So when we move to the first slide of the second paragraph, then we can look at the document production process, and what we will see is really that controls are often fragmented. And that of course is a very, very simplified value chain, where you have typically internal systems where information is born and created. Then you have different expert teams. We could have even said internal expert teams, because a PRIIPs expert is not necessarily an SFDR expert or an AFMD expert, and therefore you have all these expert teams that work with overlapping information but different regulatory requirements to produce certain outputs. As firms not always can build these outputs internally, simply because they have not the technology, the capacity, they rely on expert providers. Now, of course, expert providers are great partners of fund firms in order to help them producing PRIIPs kits or fact sheets or SFDR disclosures. They are also great partners to perform calculations. However, in a delegation situation, of course, the regulator is always going to say you can never delegate responsibility. And as a matter of fact, you have to perform certain oversight and certain controls. What we have seen in the question before is that over 50% of the firms rely on sample checks. So even if you use a checklist, then it remains a sample check. And as a consequence, there is a limited oversight in an external vendor and delegation situation. So we have seen that the top risk that was seen was missed updates. And that's exactly coincidentally what we have said here, Susanna, in production: late detection, late error detection. Because the worst thing that can happen is that actually missed updates only get recognized once the documents have been filed with the regulator and or published to the market. So in this case, it would either be a question coming back from the regulator that highlights there was a missed update or an inconsistency, or a complaint from an investor or a distributor who has actually identified something. The manual review and sampling only, yet again, as if we would have known what the participants would answer, Susanne, is of course a key item. And then last point is the limited audit trail when it comes to the filing and the publication. So all of this value chain is really super complex because it's actually not one line, right? We have many different disclosures that fund firms have to produce. I mentioned already a few with PRIIPs kit and SFDR. Even SFDR is not just one disclosure, but it's multiple disclosures. Then we have all the data standards where we have very relevant information like the MiFID data that has to be seen in conjunction with the PRIIPs information, because both is relevant for the distribution of the fund. If it's an Article 8 or 9 fund, then also the EET is relevant for the distribution. So therefore, you have to make sure that although there is complex data flows, you do not manage updates in isolation, but you actually have a straight through processing, ideally technology-based, where information from the source is flowing to all area where it's actually needed in order to produce an output, so that you do not have this reactive detection, but you actually start building consistency by design. And in an environment where you don't have that, well, then you need to have technology that helps you to perform oversight at scale. And oversight at scale means that you do no longer have incomplete coverage when it comes to the checks of the disclosures. May this be from a regulatory perspective, but also from a data perspective, and move away from I check 5% or 10% of my total volume to I actually check everything because there is silent drifts. And these silent drifts we see most often happening actually in translations, where firms operate in a large cross-border environment, that some languages may suddenly start to be off, not because you do a mistake, but because potentially the translation agency in this case is making one word different, that sometimes if a share class is accumulating or distributing, that one word as a difference already makes a big difference from a regulatory and distribution perspective. So when we go to the next slide, then what we see is the consequence really of the limited checks, because they lead to compliance, reputational, and operational risks. One of the problems that, of course, we see is that you can have an update in your base language, but has it really flown through in all of your other languages? I mentioned already, especially firms with many, many different languages, they have this additional challenge of not just managing data and the base language narrative, and maybe performing oversight of an outsourced producer, but also they have an additional outsourcing for the translation agency. So, and then the consequence is that you may have a risk in the production process itself already, and a risk in the translation process on top of that. So the remediation is costly, time consuming, and reputationally damaging. Remediation actually always means in this case that it's a late detection. And when the market has identified it and or the regulator coming back and saying there is something that seems to not be correct here, then of course a remediation always becomes an urgency, always disrupts the BAU business, because everyone has to not just fix the problem, but also analyze why was this actually off. And that's where we clearly see where we would also help firms to not just fixing things that were identified, but also analyzing what was the root cause that has led to that inconsistency. And when I say inconsistency, it's important that everyone understands that what we do with ALFI here is regulatory checks, but a PRIIPs kit in itself can look compliant and can pass all regulatory checks, Because if you were, as a simple example, to check the transaction cost number, if it's there, because it's a regulatory requirement in a PRIIPs kit, then you may tick the box because the number is there. But suddenly, if you put it in the context of an EMT or a fact sheet where you may disclose that figure, and the numbers strongly or materially deviate from each other, then although the regulatory check may have passed, the consistency check may not pass. And therefore, don't just look at regulatory requirements and controls at document level in isolation, but also look at consistency controls across disclosures as a complementary action towards full regulatory compliance. And last but not least, no matter what your production situation is, you can never delegate responsibility, right? Responsibility always remains with the firm, and responsibility is not just a la DORA. I have a DORA register for my ICT providers, but actually also I can evidence the oversight that I'm performing in any delegated environment. So when we move to the next slide,
I think it's time for the next
yeah,
more questions.
exactly.
And the last two, we have to
Exactly.
say. So still two multiple choice questions. The first, the tool, what is the most important condition for trusting AI-supported compliance controls? A, human review and final approval. B, clear audit trail and source references. C, transparent rule logic. D, strong data protection and access controls. Or E, validation before operational use. Please vote.
That's a very strong opinion from the audience.
Strong tendency, yes.
As if the audience would have known that we have a final slide that says that we're not aiming to replace the compliance expert, but to support the compliance expert.
Give him the right tool at hand.
Yes. Great.
Yeah, I think it's a clear
Yes.
result.
Yes.
Human review and final approval wins.
Correct. So we can move to the last question.
Last question. Where would operationalized and regulatory guidance be most useful? For PRIIPs kits, for SFDR disclosures, fact sheets and marketing materials, the UK CCI disclosure, or vendor oversight or outsourcing controls?
So it seems we have the next topic discovered already.
Likely, yes.
So at least the good news is that PRIIPs doesn't seem to be irrelevant, because a quarter, it's quite balanced. A quarter is also looking for operationalizing PRIIPs guidances. And I think with all the changes you mentioned up on the horizon, Susanna, there is clearly some additional work to be done in the next couple of months. UK CCI, to me, honestly, is not necessarily surprised that it's so low, because of course it's only impacting those firms distributing in the UK. What we know, however, is that everyone who is distributing in the UK, for them, it's really a big topic. And I know that ALFI is engaged in these conversations with the investment associations as well, right?
Yes, indeed. We are in exchange and submitted some questions to them.
Yes. Great. So then we can close that poll as well and move to the next slide, which is the partnership. So this partnership between ALFI and Kreios follows an announcement that Kreios made in February this year already, where we've signed a similar partnership with the BVI in Germany. And what we really wanted to achieve, and this was born by the fact that I've been the chair of the PRIIPs expert group at IFAMA back in the days, and all the association create great best practice guidances. But if you look at how these best practice guidances are used in the day-to-day operations of firms, then often there is these 1 or 2 people who have access to the ALFI Q&A, and whenever there is a question coming from the production or the market, then people will start looking into this. So it's always reactive. Of course, you can add a chatbot on it in order to search and find information faster, but it's still not application of these best practices at scale. So what we really wanted to make sure is that we apply these controls at scale. And that's the combination of point number 1 and 2, systematic application, but also to the full universe. At the same time, and that's why we're not surprised by the response from the first question of the last poll, it needs to be transparent and secure, of course. So the user always has to understand why certain things have happened and why the system was deciding what it was deciding. And the last point, really, there is no conflict of interest when it comes to this initiative, because the platform is completely agnostic of whether a document and a disclosure was produced in-house by a firm or by vendor A, B, C, or D. And Kreios itself is not offering any production. So it was super important for us that we remain this independent oversight layer, agnostic of organizational setups, agnostic of provider setups, and not at the same time offering anything that we check ourselves on behalf or for the members. So when we move to the next slide, then we, of course, needed a starting point, and the starting point was really PRIIPs. We could have started with SFDR, as this was apparently the slightly number one priority, but PRIIPs is much bigger in terms of its volumes and its impact, and therefore we said, okay, there is a huge Q&A from ALFI that has a lot of intelligence already inbuilt. It's very mature because it has been a working document by the members over many, many years. And it helps firms in these manual oversight setups to manage high volumes, different languages, etc., and we can add a lot of value for the member firms on the topic of PRIIPs. It doesn't mean that we will stop there, and SFDR certainly is a topic we're already looking into. From a consistency check perspective, we're already doing this. From a regulatory guidance perspective, that is going to be one of the next items that we certainly have planned. When we move to the next slide, then we have the actual process. So what is now the actual method that we do? So we take the ALFI Q&A, where there is a lot of narrative, a lot of text in it, and we do not just give this to an AI, because that would not allow to eliminate and minimize certain AI-related risks like hallucination and bias, etc. What we do is human experts extract those components from the Q&A that are actually rules and checkable descriptions, and they will be translated by an AI into an actual algorithm. So that means that when we have the digital validation rule, that is no longer actually an AI, and under the definition of the EU AI Act, it's not even an AI system anymore, because it has become a deterministic machine-readable rule in our platform. And that means there can't be any hallucination, there can't be any bias. It's a black and white decision. If you run through that check 1,000 times, it's going to give you 1,000 times the same response. Now, of course, on the process from the structuring to the digital rule, there can be errors and there can be mistakes, so that the digital rule in the first place does not actually check what it's supposed to check. That's why in the step 4, we have expert validations, where we, on the platform, even fully transparent, can create test cases based on which documents, which rule has been not only created, but also tested. And that then, once the expert validation is done, we have the operational compliance layer, where then, of course, it doesn't matter to the platform whether a check is performed on 1, 10, 100, or 1,000 documents. You can apply these checks at scale. When we move to the next slide, conscious a bit of time, because we're really far ahead, very briefly, there is different level in regulation, and what you see is there is always the law, the RTS, the ESA Q&As, which is the regulatory Q&As, and then there is ALFI and the BWI. In Germany, it's called the BWI Musterbausteine for PRIIPs. But of course, in-house interpretations. the platform does not impose which controls you have to apply. So you can basically mimic your own version of what compliance and OK means on the platform by selecting or unselecting certain recommendations. The combination of ALFI and BVI in this case also helps you to follow on the one hand the Luxembourg market, but if you distribute in Germany, you may also want to follow the German recommendations. But if you agree to some and disagree to others, that's exactly where you can select which ones you want to apply and which ones you want to hold back or even replace by your own in-house interpretations. Now, on the next slide, we have this these different layers where you see, okay, this is exactly the way how regulatory guidance now becomes a checkable rule. The only thing that I want to add on this slide, again, conscious of time, is that you move away from we are confident that we are compliant to we can actually demonstrate that we have checked all the disclosures following the rules X, Y, and Z. And the regulatory component is one, the data consistency component towards other disclosures is the other point. And we want to conclude then with the last slide on the next one that supports one of the important answers also, Susanne, from the members on the last question, right? As if we would have anticipated it. So Regmatics as a platform is absolutely with no means to replace the legal or the compliance expert. It is rather, my colleague always calls it the superpower of the compliance and legal experts who rather want to spend their time on reviewing anomalies and findings than reviewing things with the hope to find something that they can actually flag, right? So as a consequence, you have rules and guidances that you turn into controls that are usable at scale. You have the means and the technology to evidence that, which ultimately leads to your assurance to be able for internal audit, external regulators, etc., to evidence consistent application of regulation as well as consistency checks across versions, languages, and document types.
Thank you, Ulf. That was a lot of information, and we come to the Q&A session for the last minute, actually. But I mean, we got a number of questions before the webinar, and feel free to send us additional questions. So we will look maybe at one or two, and the others will be responded on an individual basis. So how can ALFI members benefit from the cooperation?
Yeah, the immediate benefit is obviously that you have stronger consistency, transparency, and auditability in the production associated control processes. As we have seen, a lot of firms still rely on manned sample checks. Of course, there is also a financial benefit in that sense, as that ALFI members will actually not have to pay for the ALFI Q&A rule set, but only the platform usage fee as such when it comes to the control of the regulatory requirements. And then, of course, any updates on the guidances will be continuously reflected in the platform as such. And it's built for expansion so that firms that want to rely on this platform now for PRIIPs, of course, when we start working on SFDR, there is no work related for the members. It's just going to be another, let's say, rule card set, and they can throw their SFDR disclosures in it.
Thank you. Then how can asset managers realistically integrate AI tools into existing PRIIPs and kit production workflows without disrupting current controls?
Yeah, it was super important for us that we are agnostic of the organizational and production setup. So that's why we do not require firms to change anything on their current setup. You could typically add AI as this independent control layer, not necessarily for content generation, but really more for the checks. And that's why also on Regmatics, you don't really have any onboarding or lead time. It's just available and ready to consume PRIIPs kits and other document types to check consistency and compliance.
Okay, I think I select the last question. Let's take this one. How can smaller players leverage their agility without compromising on security?
Of course, smaller players have the advantage of shorter decision paths, right? And less legacy complexity often because you have faster implementation cycles. The agility, however, needs to be governed, and it shouldn't mean that you have the informal and uncontrolled use of AI. So therefore, we always say that also with pragmatics starts more with a selection of use cases, selection of documents, although of course you can think of your entire organization being covered by a control layer. But you need to have quick wins to demonstrate the value, and therefore use the size also as an advantage to decide quicker and do not require to build up new capacity just because you want to build up more control and oversight.
Yes. I think I still add one point, which is important because you spoke a lot about automation.
Yeah.
So what are the key control points that should remain manual?
Well, the members even answered that already in the poll, right? And this is also the way how the platform is built. The platform is not designed in a way that it's actually replacing the human in the control process. So we would not necessarily see that someone, whether it's internal or via a provider, someone produces a PRIIPs kit, the platform checks it, and then it's validated and be filed to the regulator. At this point, you may even then suddenly consider the system being a high-risk AI system if you consider AI being part of the process. So therefore, human review and validation remains central, right? The platform is rather the superpower to make everything checkable, everything controllable, everything documentable and auditable. So that instead of saying we've checked 5 things, we check 100%, and the human expert, legal compliance reporting teams, conducting officers, they can focus on anomalies and follow-up.
Thank you very much, Ulf. I think that was very useful for all those who followed this morning. And as I said, we will keep in touch on the questions that have been raised. And yeah, thank you to everyone who contributed to this webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone, for your question, for joining, for your answers. Thank you, Susanne, and thank you, the
Thank
ALFI
you.
team.
Bye.
Bye.